All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Matsen, and I am your host. In this episode, we have got my good friends, Kurt Francom and Pastor Jeff McCullough here. The three of us all together for the very first time, the three amigos. Welcome, Kurt and Jeff.
Yeah, this could get dangerous, but thanks for having us. So.
Yeah, this is exciting. I didn't realize it until we were doing the pre-call here that as much as I talk with Greg and as much as I talk with Kurt, I don't think we've all three been in the same conversation. So this is going to be fun.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens here. This will be fun. So you've got a Hello Saints virtual summit coming up. It's an interfaith virtual summit coming up in June. And that kind of triggers our discussion here today to go over some interfaith issues and kind of what you've learned, each of you have learned in going through the process of working between evangelicals primarily and Latter-day Saints. I want to start off, Kurt, I want to ask you this first, okay? What is the hardest thing in trying to start an interfaith relationship with a Protestant evangelical?
Well, Jeff makes it easy for sure, but I think a lot of people don't realize, it really is a skill set. At least that's been my experience of, man, like just getting practice at walking into a church or asking the hard question or how do I respond to a question without getting, defaulting to being defensive because I tell Jeff all the time, there's few Latter-day Saints who haven't had a really negative experience with an evangelicals. I can go back to several on my mission, where I felt like I was cornered so naturally I respond to these relationships with a little more defensiveness. And so I've just noticed just in my journey, engaging with Jeff and developing our friendship and working on some of the videos, I've felt the skill set kind of develop, and I would love for more and other people to develop the same thing, because it's not just I'll just take a casserole over to my Baptist neighbor and that's good enough. I think there's a lot more we could accomplish by engaging in these relationships in a more intentional way.
Yeah, you could bring Jell-O too. I mean,
that's right.
Yeah. So what is it? What are these skill sets? I mean, what is the tool set here that you're talking about that you've developed?
I would say, just starting from a place of listening and being open, and not that we're not trying to correct each other just so that you're clear. This is what I believe. Just being open and understanding where they're coming from. And there's been several conversations with Jeff or others where I kind of feel like, man, I completely disagree with what you're saying, but I can sit with that. I can listen, and so, and that sometimes that we're afraid of these conversations because we feel like, well, I gotta be able to come back with 2 or 3 scriptures as far as what we believe, but it's okay to just listen and absorb the information.
Yeah. Jeff, same question to you. What has been the hardest thing in your last year and a half or more, in trying to create a relationship with Latter-day Saints, an interfaith relationship, right? Because there's a separate little relationship. You can all be neighbors, you can kind of be friends, but for us three, for example, religion is a big part of our relationship.
Yeah. Right.
It is. In fact, it's right there at the center of all of this. And yet we're all really good friends.
Yeah. I think that maybe the frustration that I experience, well, first of all, let me say the thing that I don't have to deal with that Kurt and you have to deal with, and that is when a Latter-day Saint is engaging with an evangelical, it can be so unpredictable. You don't really know what you're dealing with, because it could be somebody who is very hostile. It could be somebody who's actually on the opposite and very, open and welcoming, or it could be someone in the middle who doesn't know a ton. And as they learn a little bit more from you, they are willing to kind of engage, or they don't know a whole lot, but once they learn a bit more from you, then they push away and say, wait a minute, I don't want anything to do with you. There's this unpredictability that I can acknowledge just within my own context that I haven't had to deal with, because one thing that's made it somewhat easier than I was expecting is the receptivity that Latter-day Saints have to these types of conversations. And I give credit to the missionary culture that you guys have, and getting the reps in, going door to door, or engaging with people at, in various other missionary contexts. There's a lot of training that goes into it, and some skin that gets thickened, I believe, and maybe even some patience that can develop. So there's so much that makes the conversation inviting from my standpoint that I don't hit that frustration off the bat. My frustration doesn't come until I get a little further into the conversation. And there is, there have been, through the history of the church, I don't know the sources, they're probably varied, but there are certain like one-liners, or there are certain maybe scripts that I can tell. The way I put it is, I can tell when somebody kind of kicks into missionary mode and they begin to regurgitate something that's been fed to them that is a misconception or misrepresentation, that I have to be like, hold on a second, let's walk this back a little bit. And I know that Latter-day Saints deal with that as well. But, I think a good example is, I was talking to somebody who is trying to prove to me why all the different translations of the Bible are bad. And it's the reason why we have infant baptism. And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
I haven't even heard that.
Where did you hear that? And they were evidently trained to say, well, one of the things that, infant baptism comes from is a different version of the Bible. I was like, yeah, that's not true. Let's try to walk that back and let me. So it's more of there are some collective perceptions that Latter-day Saints have, and just kind of rewiring, retraining, and educating can get a little bit frustrating, only because I have to say it over and over again.
Okay. So, what I would say is, I remember, Jeff, you and I had a presentation to several hundred Latter-day Saints a couple months ago. And one of the things we were talking about we were talking a little bit of doctrine at the time. And you had said something that I would disagree with at that time. And I remember turning to the audience and say, well, I could debate, I could argue this point, right? But what's the point of doing that? And I think that's the thing that I've learned the most in an interfaith relationship is stop trying to be right. That shouldn't be the primary issue that you're looking at. And that's what's frustrating to me. And that's not just with Protestant. It could be Jewish. It could be Muslim. It could be Catholic. It doesn't matter, right? When we're putting forward the idea that we're right, because I think I'm right. You think you're right, Jeff. And Kurt, you and I would have disagreements too. You think you're right. I think I'm right. But when that becomes primary in an interfaith discussion, you have just eliminated any chance to build a relationship because you've prioritized the argument over the person, right? And so I think in our traditions we've both done that to the point of a Bible bashing kind of a scenario where it's like, yeah, but look at Ephesians XYZ or look at John, and it's like, hold on here, let's just stop and talk about this a little bit and build a relationship. And what I've really appreciated with you, Jeff, is, we've built a relationship where I can actually go in and say something I really disagree with without, I think, breaking a trust with you, because it's already built, right? There's already like, I care about you. I hope, right? I care about you. That you're a friend of mine. And so we can actually talk about these other things with a foundation of a relationship and trust that's already in place.
Yeah. One thing I'll insert there is that I think definitely in our tradition, Greg, and I'm sure with Jeff's or the Protestant tradition, is we sort of hold up the value of truth, like to be paramount. Like we've got to get to the truth. And if we can't get to the truth, like that's the most important. And I see this many times in our, we worry about individuals maybe losing faith, just generally speaking, or leaving our faith tradition. And so we default to, well, if they just knew the truth, if I just got them the history and the references and the resources, and they just knew the truth, that would do it. When in reality, I think as humans, how we're built is typically we value relationship above truth. Now, truth is still important. I don't want to diminish that. And I think it's a worthwhile effort to continue to learn and go after truth. However, I think relationship is paramount in a lot of these dynamics, even with our relationship with God. And, Greg, we've had conversations about this as well on your podcast, where we just want to default to truth. And in reality, it's like whatever keeps us engaged in the relationship with God, that's good enough for me. And there's probably things I believe that are untrue. There's probably things that Jeff believes that we'll find out someday are untrue. But nonetheless, we're both engaged with this relationship with God, and that relationship is going to be highlighted, and we'll learn that relationship more as we engage with each other and seek relationship rather than just truth.
Yeah, and I think that's where collectively, when what we've been able to experience on a one-on-one level, or maybe a micro community level within this Hello Saints experience or experiment that's been going on, where when you zoom back, one of the things that I am realizing, a couple things. One, there have been others that have gone before us that have really tried to broker these types of conversations. And for whatever reason, they've become echoes of the past. And 27 years ago, a book was released called How Wide the Divide by, guys like Richard Millett and Robinson from BYU, and Blomberg and Mao from evangelical seminaries. And they actually all took a lot of flack for that. We're talking in the late 90s. And if you go and you look at How Wide the Divide, just that book, and its summary, even on Amazon, it's interesting because, it talks about how the readers of this book are going to be quite surprised at where there's alignment, even though there are fundamental differences. And the way my wife puts it, as we've been sort of walking through this, is there's so much that we can and should be connecting over and having to work through and reconcile. The frustration that I can experience and deal with is that there isn't quite as much motivation from the evangelical side to really engage there, beyond proselytizing, beyond converting people. Again, if there are people that feel that draw, okay, but why is that all we're doing? And I like the way that Joy, she said it the other day. She goes, here we are, we've been doing this for a couple of years. Joy's my wife, by the way, for people who don't know. We've been doing this for a couple of years. We now are in Utah. We are now, the way I've been putting it is like, we are now like pretty much, we're in Zarahemla, and nobody on the outside knows what's going on over here. And what can be frustrating for us is we're almost feeling this burden of responsibility, which is one of the motivations behind the summit, to let people know what's on the other side of the burnt bridges. Because there has been so much thought and processing and refinement from a Latter-day Saint standpoint when it comes to your own faith, culture, beliefs, doctrines. And there needs to be a massive refresh there. And so by bringing more voices to the table with this summit, that's the hope, is to get beyond, this.
Let me follow up with that, Jeff, real quick. Why is that important? Why is that important that there's an understanding on either side? But in your instance, you're saying from the evangelical side, across those bridges, how wide the divide? Why is it important to cross that?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I think from a cultural standpoint, you'll hear a lot of people say, well, and I'll hear this mainly from Latter-day Saints. This culture, this world, this society is moving in a specific direction. And those of us who are of faith, at some point, we're going to need each other. So we've got to stop beating each other up. I think that there's some of that there. I think another reason why it's important is because we're hurting each other. I really feel like we are. And I get, I can hear my evangelicals say right now, well, the truth hurts. It's like, yes, I get it. But Jesus didn't have to hurt the woman at the well whenever he was talking about truth. He didn't have to hurt Nicodemus. They didn't walk away hurt. If anybody got hurt, it was the rich young ruler who went away sad because Jesus said, you have to sell all your stuff. And that was completely because he was showing them the audience how we can disconnect truth from love. And I think we hurt one another too often in this space when we can have healthy relationship. I think the third reason why it's important, and we talked about this on the presentation that we gave, Greg, because when we're preaching at each other till we're blue in the face, at some point it stops looking like Jesus to me. If we both claim to follow Jesus, and I get there's going to be arguments on whether it's the same Jesus and all that other stuff, different conversation. But the reality is we both claim to follow Jesus. We both desire to emulate the one who is represented in the Gospels. And are we doing that? And I would contend between both faith groups, we've not done a very good job with that historically.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll add that another reason why that's important is in my experience is my Latter-day Saint faith has never been stronger than engaging in these conversations and articulating my faith and understanding it more deeply. And, like Jeff said, we've seen these examples in the past of like Millet and other scholars, both Latter-day Saint and Protestant scholars coming together and talking. And we almost want to like outsource it to them. Like, yeah, you guys have the conversation because you guys are really smart and you know the scriptures, you know all these things, but there's a deeper meaning and purpose when the lay person tries to engage in these conversations. And the more that Jeff and others can model how that's done, and that you're willing to walk across the street or engage with your coworker and have these really meaningful discussions, I think it's just well worth that. And, one of the most beautiful experiences in this that I've had is finding maybe a puzzle piece or two in the evangelical tradition that I love, and to turn around and see, oh, that fits perfectly into my tradition as well. Like, of course, there's other pieces where we just miss each other, but to find sort of that holy envy in other faith traditions and realize that can still be, framed well and articulated from my faith tradition as well, is a beautiful discovery and brings me more, it brings me closer to God.
Yeah. You talk about outsourcing. I don't know how much this is relevant in the Protestant world. I'm sure it is to some degree, especially to scholars, but in the Latter-day Saint world, we outsource quite a bit of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, oh yeah, that's your job. Right. Interfaith work is your job. Yeah. You're supposed to talk to the leaders of the other churches and et cetera. That's the interfaith work that happens, which I completely disagree with. And I think that's a real shame. I think it's a very good point, Kurt. I think that, to engage with others is to understand yourself better, to understand your beliefs, right? To be able to articulate them, to understand others' beliefs, right? I think that these are very important things and tools and skills that we all need to learn that make us better human beings, right? And in our vernacular, make us better children of God. You had something to add to that, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I continue 2.5 years into this, feel so energized by the conversation, because absolutely there's outsourcing that takes place in our context. It's usually outsourced to the pastor.
Yeah.
Okay, so here I am, but I'm not doing it by staying behind my pulpit within my, sanitized church environment. I've gone out and I've tried to be. I'm borrowing this from you, Greg, because you're the first one that used this term. I think you label yourself this, and I fully align with this as well, as an ambassador. We don't all have to be evangelists. We don't all have to be teachers and prophets and all that other. Some of us, it's okay if we just have that more ambassador role to go in there. And when I can emulate to evangelicals that posture that says, when I'm speaking with a Latter-day Saint, I'm actually going to be advocating for the Protestant evangelical tradition. But when I then go back to my evangelical Protestant friends, I can advocate for a clarity and an understanding of my Latter-day Saint friends and traditions and cultures and doctrine. And I think that's exciting to me right now, because this outsourcing that's been brought to these social media platforms isn't hanging in the atmosphere of BYU and Fuller Seminary. It's descending down, and it's rippling through the pews. It's part of everyday conversation as to how we can forge this path together. And to me, that's what makes this really exciting.
Well, and technology democratizes interfaith relationships.
Right.
Right. It's like it's everybody has this opportunity. What we're doing here right now. In fact, any of our relationships here probably would not have happened without technology.
True.
Yeah. I wouldn't know either one of you.
Yeah.
Right. So, Kurt, how wide is the divide between evangelicals and Latter-day Saints? Because, here's this title, How Wide is the Divide? I read the book many, many years ago. I don't remember what the result was. I know that they talked about some of the similarities and some of the differences and whatnot. But do you find that the more you speak with Jeff and the other Protestants, that the divide is not as wide as you might have thought, or not as wide as many Latter-day Saints may think?
Well, I'm speaking from I'm a Utah boy, right? Born and raised in Utah, as the dominant religion. And so in the traditional, Arizona, Utah, Idaho location, I think that definitely the divide is wide, just because we're not forced to engage with that diversity of religion a lot. Again, it's not necessarily our fault, but where I talk with maybe some of my Latter-day Saint friends in Springfield, Missouri, who every day they've got the pastors next door, or they're constantly engaging with different evangelical faiths that I think have a little bit more of an understanding, or that the divide isn't as wide for them, just because that's just naturally where they're at. But I think it's just beneficial for those who maybe are too much in that bubble, the Latter-day Saint bubble, to say, I'm going to make a real effort here to reach out. And I drive by this church all the time, and I've never had reason to go there. I don't even know anybody that attends there, but you know what? As a Latter-day Saint, or as a bishop, as a Relief Society president, I'm going to walk in there on Sunday, or I'm going to just find out who the pastor is and start a dialogue and see if we can make our community better and more and stronger because of that interfaith effort.
Jeff, how wide is the divide?
Yeah, I think I would say there's a perceived divide, and then I don't know what I would call the other one. There's a maybe a divide that we can look at through more spiritual lenses. I think the perceived divide is pretty dang wide.
Mm-hmm.
And I can vouch for that, because that's where we get into the minutia of different doctrines. And as we weight doctrines differently, when
different values on different things.
100%. So
Yep.
like a Latter-day Saint is being 100% truthful. And they're like, there's more similarity than differences. It's not, the differences aren't that big of a deal, right? Well, that's because they weight their doctrines differently than an evangelical is going to come back and be like, no, but doctrines A, B, and C, they're big for us. They're a big deal. We weight those differently. So there's a lot of work to do to close that gap of accepting where we each stand, and that doesn't even speak to the misconceptions that Latter-day Saints are only worried about being the God of their planet one day, or the misperception that there's 44,000 Christian denominations and they all think the other ones are going to hell, whatever. We got a lot of work to do to dispel those misconceptions. Now, I think there's a spiritual answer to that question, a scriptural answer to that question. And Greg, it's where you and I always go back, and it's a woman at the well.
Mm-hmm.
I think the perceived divide in John chapter 4 was insurmountable. That's the whole point of John chapter 4. It's a woman of sordid past getting water by herself in the middle of the day in Samaria, being engaged by a Jewish rabbi. There's, and I'm not even naming all the reasons why there's perceived divide or cultural divide. And yet he sat down right next to her.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a conversation about physical need, spiritual need, religious differences, personal situation, and ultimate fulfillment in what God has to offer us. Where we get into that realm, I don't think it's that wide. I think that there's a lot of really, really powerful connection that can be made there if we're just willing to go there.
I think that, if I'm answering my own question, I think that if you call it the perceived divide, I think it is much smaller than people think. And it is a wonderful, Christ-like, godly endeavor, I believe, to learn from each other and to learn what our similarities and our differences are. Now, I do not believe that the point is for any of us that we try to shrink the actual real divide, right? Mm. That would mean compromising on what we all believe. And we all have a strong testimony and certitude of certain doctrines that are different from each other, right? And to compromise on those would be to compromise on God for each of us.
Right.
Right. So those do exist. So I don't think that I was going to say el propósito, the purpose of this is to is to, I'm going back to my missionary days here, is to shrink the divide. The key is to understand what is the divide first, because we don't even know, because we're not in each other's camps. Right. And so much confusion comes from just from ignorance.
Yeah.
On both sides. And so if we can actually just know what the divide is first, because we don't know, just if we know the divide first and we build that understanding and that reality off of relationships, then we can talk about these other places where, okay, we're probably not going to compromise on these things, but we can work with each other on it, right? I can look through Jeff's eyes on how he would see this and have some empathy and understanding of these things. So, and that relationship also, I believe, is built in our case, certainly, on me understanding Jeff's devotion to God, right? And so I don't have to say, you're wrong, Jeff. I am first going to put a value on Jeff has a good heart. Jeff is devoted to God. And that is really important, even if I disagree with him. Does that make sense?
Makes complete sense. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well,
ahead,
I'll just add here that that you talk about that perceived divide, and sometimes you hear it so much, like in the media or even online, like never have we been so divided, and in politics and this and that in society. And in reality, I think never have we had such terrible tools of connecting, like social media, YouTube. I mean, we all use these things, but there are terrible ways of building that relationship. And so I think one hope through the Hello Saints Summit and just the content that Jeff produces and all of us produce is we want to take these engagements offline to these modern day wells, right? Where people are just going through their day-to-day activities, knowing that we're different, knowing that there's a perceived divide there, and engaging there. I've often sent Jeff, links to different videos of maybe two Protestants talking about the Latter-day Saint faith tradition, and it's so offensive to hear two people tell me what I'm thinking or how I really see things. When in reality, I'm like, you guys are so far off, right? And I know Jeff experienced the same way, seeing people, Latter-day Saints, who don't have an evangelical in the room, try and articulate what they're thinking, and this is what they really mean, and this is what their deep thoughts are. It's like, that is so toxic for our society, for our relationship. The more we can have this content online to learn and start that understanding, but we've got to take them offline to real people who we can look in the eyes and say, no, really, what do you mean by this? Like, why do you do that thing or this thing? And again, we gain understanding. I can't help but walk away from my engagements with Jeff and think he's a God-fearing individual who loves Jesus Christ, and I want to associate more with those types of people.
Yeah, Jeff, what are your thoughts on the real divide, right? And learning that first, and then also the value of seeing each other as God-fearing individuals.
I mean, I just feel like we so often sabotage ourselves, and that's where I've experienced more of the divide. So the demonization of one another, where there are differences, like we're talking about, there's differences. Why does that equate to us being unkind to each other? Why does that equate to us demonizing or needing to tell someone, talking from my perspective, that you're going to hell or that you need to get yourself right? That's not. We're getting in our own way there, and I think that where we are able to, and I know I might be speaking kind of directly here, but to me, that's a maturity issue. It really is what it kind of comes down to. And part of my journey going from, I released a video soon after I launched the channel, former Mount Mormon bashing pastor, whatever it was. And it's because I was uninformed in so many ways about a grown-up adult way to talk about this stuff. Like, part of this too that I'm appreciating is, yes, it's growing in relationship. Yes, it's becoming more informed. It's also maturing. It's also like kind of growing up and allowing Christ to perfect me, as Kurt was talking about, to like gain that skill set when it comes to how we articulate what we believe in and understand how other people believe. So I think that where we can get to a point where we're not demonizing one another, at that point, things get super exciting. Like the sky's the limit at that point, because then we can engage in the divide. And I love what you're saying, Greg, that like, it's not necessarily about closing the divide, okay? Because that we're not trying to compromise everything we believe till we just have nothing between us but a rubble of former doctrines. We can maintain our convictions, which is really what the whole point of the summit is. I mean, I've got 20 speakers from Protestant and Latter-day Saint backgrounds speaking on specific topics. And I gave all of them instruction. This is not, you're not giving a comparative analysis here. Okay. So Latter-day Saint, you're not going to articulate the evangelical view. Evangelical, you're not to articulate the Latter-day Saint view. You are to articulate your respective view, so that if somebody's coming to the summit, they can say, now I am fully informed on this topic from both a Latter-day Saint and a Protestant evangelical view. I think if there's a prerequisite, though, for anybody attending the summit, it's that we do have to put aside the demonization of one another. If you're willing to do that and then come to the summit, I think that's where we open up a lot of doors within your specific sphere of influence in your community as an individual to really have some exciting engagement.
Kurt, one thing that I see in response on both sides, there's kind of like a watershed when there's someone coming out and trying to build interfaith relationships, which, by the way, I certainly think it's the same on the evangelical side, but on the Latter-day Saint side, we haven't built ourselves for that. Honestly, I mean, we're a missionary church,
yeah,
right? We are a missionary church, and so it's a totally different tool set, and skill set, like you're talking about. And people don't have those tools necessarily, and so it seems to be one of two reactions: is like, "Wow, this is great. I love seeing this. I've got evangelical friends, I've got evangelical family members, and because I've had this when I've had shows with Jeff." And they're like, oh, I sent this to all my family because half of us are evangelical and half of us are Latter-day Saints. And this is so great. And this is better than our dinner discussions, And
yeah.
So, you get that kind of like, this is wonderful. But on the other side, it's like, what are you doing? Right. I mean, and honestly, I know, because I'm coming from a Latter-day Saint perspective, if I go through my comments, I'm going to have a lot of evangelical comments that, they're not very nice. And, and so I'm like, okay, but then I also get Latter-day Saint comments, which aren't very nice, that are like, what are you doing? What does this mean? What is, is he getting baptized? It's like, I don't know. Do you experience the same thing, Kurt?
Yeah, it's with our faith tradition, it's beautiful that we've many of us have had this this experience where we've spent 2 years roughly being a full-time missionary, and so it's easy for us to get into that gear. A lot of the Latter-day Saints, unless they have opportunity to serve on their state communications council or in some of those interfaith, where it is a different gear. And I've almost wish, in a perfect world, we could spend 2 years doing the full-time missionary thing and 2 years doing the communications thing, because they are very clear in those roles. Like, this is not about baptisms. It's not about telling them who's right and who's wrong. This is about creating relationships. And so I think just naturally we're built in a missionary way, because that's what's been emphasized. That's where the dedication has been, where, we took 2 years of our life to spend time there, where we haven't necessarily done that. And so I think it would benefit everybody to understand that there are active formal efforts in the church led by priesthood keys, as we would frame it, that are not about baptisms. It's about interfaith. It's about, communications and building relationships in your community.
Jeff, do you find that there is in that reaction, because you're going to experience the same thing on your end, right? From positive and negative from evangelicals, positive and negative from Latter-day Saints. I see it, and I think on the negative side, so much of it is two things. It is ignorance and it's fear, right? There's a fear that is saying, I can't step out there because I am very comfortable right here. And if I'm stepping out, that's not something I'm used to doing. Am I approving of the other side? Why am I, even opening up communication, right? Do you think that is that right? Is it ignorance and fear, or is there something else?
Yeah, I think for sure there's ignorance in people not being fully informed. And so I heard one time that Latter-day Saints believe X, Y, and Z. It's like, believe, or that was talked about at some point 80 years ago, big difference, doctrine versus something that has kind of taken a cultural grip within the Latter-day Saint community. That's different. So I don't totally, dog on evangelicals for being uninformed, because there's two things tied to that. The Latter-day Saint paradigm is, for the most part, out of sight, out of mind for us. I mean, when we're talking about 800 million Protestants in the world and another billion or more Catholics, like that's more what we're grappling with and trying to reconcile. And that's not to downplay the 17 million Latter-day Saints, but unless you're in an area where there's a concentration of Latter-day Saints, you only go by hearsay. You only go by, oh, well, I had a pastor when I was a kid tell me this, or, a professor told me that. So, and then when you add to it that there have been, when you're dealing with ongoing revelation, there is a coming and a going, an ebbing and a flowing of certain emphases, of certain focuses, of certain, even prominent teachings. So that's why, yes, there's ignorance. But then I think the fears are really what motivates sort of the hostility, in my opinion. And I just feel, for me, I get more threats from Latter-day Saints, like, you need to stop what you're doing or else type of stuff. But I get more, how would I put it? Canceling from my tribe. And one of the things that I found helpful, ignorance and fear, to try to dispel all that, is to really get into the divide, that space between evangelicals and Latter-day Saints, and be like, let's just recontextualize this for a minute. I actually went back and forth with one of my commenters, an evangelical, yesterday on this. And he was basically, Joy and I went to the Tabernacle, did a tour, went to the Tabernacle choir rehearsal. And this evangelical, who I'd seen in my comments before, said, oh, yeah, why not? While you're at it, why don't you just go walk around with some missionaries and help them share the plan of salvation? And I'm like, because I got together and listened to the hymns that are important to them, and peered into this Tabernacle choir culture, this institution. What is so violating about that? What are we afraid of there? What is so offensive with that? And then as soon as I recontextualized it, and I said, what if I went to temple with a Jewish friend, and they go the entire service basically talking about Yahweh and all this other stuff, but denying that Jesus Christ is the Messiah? You probably wouldn't have a hard time with that. And they're flat out denying Jesus as Messiah. Or if I went to a Catholic mass and the Pope was there, and I'm singing Catholic hymns with them, but absolutely disagreeing with the inspiration of the liturgy and the magisterium, would you get upset with that? And eventually this person was like, yeah, probably not. I'm like, so then why would you get so offended because I'm doing this to Latter-day Saints, who actually believe that Jesus is Messiah and have, an openness to things beyond that? And thankfully, this individual responded at the end and said, I understand where you're coming from. Thank you for explaining, Pastor. So I think at the end of the day, what a lot of this comes back to is we have to be patient. We have to continue to just patiently untangle this and sort through all this and model how this conversation needs to happen, so it's best for all of us.
Kurt, what are the things that you have learned the most in working with Jeff and others from other denominations in an interfaith role?
Yeah. I think the big thing is that there's really nothing to be afraid of with each other. Just the video that Jeff did where he took me to 3 different churches, on one Sunday, and just walking in there, like if I was by myself or I just decided to do that on a whim, I'd be scared, or I'd be like, what are they going to say? Or are they going to, what if they find out I'm a Latter-day Saint? But so that's a big thing, just that once we get together, like we jive so well together, you know, and especially those moments where we're not even talking about faith or theology or any of that. Like we're so much alike in those contexts. And I just appreciate learning. You know, I've told Jeff this before. There's a pastor, I think he's in Georgia, named Andy Stanley, and pretty much every week I listen to his sermon on YouTube. And there's a lot of times I'm like, oh man, you know, he's 80% there. Like if he only had the whole thing, right? But nonetheless, I just appreciate learning how they articulate the gospel, how they see Jesus, how they interpret different stories. And like I said, a lot of times it's still in line with everything I believe, and my faith is made stronger. But and it really propels me back into my own tradition, my own faith. And like I said before, my Latter-day Saint faith has never been stronger than now, and I'm just excited by seeing not only contrast but seeing similarities in our traditions. And so it's worth the effort. It's worth leaning into.
Jeff, another thing I think is really important for people to understand is that regardless of differences in doctrine, and there's some big differences, right, that we have, our traditions and I suppose our doctrine on both sides, when we are following those things on both sides, they produce certain values in people. And you can see that, right? I can see that in Protestants. I can see that in Latter-day Saints. There are certain values that are produced from these traditions that are based in Scripture, right? Isn't that part of at least what can bridge the real gap, the real divide?
I mean, yeah, there's a sort of an easily accessible application that, just like we were talking about, within our culture. Like if whenever I first moved here, I had a family member call up and they were like, so you're living in Utah now and you're with all these Latter-day Saints. Are you safe? I'm like, what do you mean am I safe? Like, they didn't move to yes, I'm safe. I'm very safe. Okay. These are great people. They're great neighbors. Not only are they not hostile, but they share some of our values, a lot of our values. In fact, that was that might have been the first domino that fell for me when I first started looking into Latter-day Saint belief. It's like, culturally, this just seems so familiar to me, even though it seems so alien. So yeah, those values that we can coalesce around and be of value more broadly in society and culturally, it would really make me scratch my head where an evangelical would say, no, I'll be involved in community stuff as long as Latter-day Saints are involved. That's strange. We overlap in so many different ways, and you add to it, it does come from a similar source. It comes from what we do see taught in the Scriptures and what we do see emulated in Jesus. So yeah, I think that there's that, but there's also like the value that it brings, in my opinion, and because I do think that the cultural value is important. I think it's in the value that points us back to ourselves too. It's not just society, but even ourselves. There's a really proficient evangelical theologian and scholar. He just passed away last year. His name is Michael Heiser. I'm a huge fan of his work. And he's been in a lot of academic dialogues, and he was contacted by someone who said, hey, I'm in the academic world. Value-wise, ethics, community, family, I align with 100% of where you align. Theologically, I have some differences in beliefs, but the stuff that you're teaching on, and he's talking about the specific doctrinal position that Michael Heiser has on the divine counsel and a few other things. He goes, I've actually been bringing this to my faith community, and I'm taking a lot of heat for it. Can I meet with you? Well, he sits down with this individual, and it turns out to be a professor from BYU, right? So I don't know who it was, and I think this was probably about 10 years ago. But as they're talking through all this, the BYU professor was finally like, can I just ask you, am I going to be in heaven with you? And Heiser, who had very little interaction with Latter-day Saints up to this point, he's like, well, everything has felt so familiar. It seems so, natural. There's a kinship here that just seems like just a natural connection. He's like, what I would like to do is just bypass predicating that answer on what church we belong to and drive more at like anybody who believes that they are saved not by their own merit, by Christ and Christ alone, and believes that their spiritual reality before Almighty God is the most important consideration for them to have, and that they look to Christ in that. I don't really necessarily care what label you put on yourself. And when I say that, like if there are evangelicals watching this, I mean, that's cancelable for me, right? For me to even say something like that, because it's our job to tell people they're going to hell, evidently. No, but if we just pause for a minute, and I'm not saved by the Baptists, I'm not saved by the Methodists, I'm not saved by the Christian Missionary Alliance. I'm saved by being reconciled to Almighty God through Christ and Christ alone. And whether you say you're a Latter-day Saint, a Catholic, or an evangelical, to me, that's the ultimate value and that I think is drawn out of. And I know it's a very long-winded answer, but I think about this quite often.
No, appreciate that. Last question here for each of you. Kurt, where does this go from here, right? Where can we see this going? I mean, maybe technology plays a larger and larger role in this. I don't know, but where does this go? Can there be a real view of how wide the divide actually is? And can there be strong relationships between especially Christian denominations?
Yeah, man, what a great question. And I think I'm not sure exactly where it goes, but, I think, like I mentioned earlier, that I just hope it goes offline into personal relationships with others, that there may be an individual out there who's maybe wrestling and praying over, how do I connect with my community that it's full of evangelicals as a Latter-day Saint, or vice versa. And they'll have a platform, a place that they can come and learn about other experiences and have the courage and faith to lean into that. So, of course, I think even our leaders at the highest levels of the church hope that interfaith efforts continue to flourish, and we've seen example after that, just on that more general level of the benefit of locking arms with some of our other Christian brothers and sisters, and regardless of what they believe or whether they're getting baptized or not, and it makes for a better world, because as we all believe, like, Jesus Christ is the answer, like, period. And if you need to go on a different path to get to the answer, then we'll have patience for that, or we'll be open to that. But I think the more we can turn the entire world towards Jesus, no matter what faith tradition it is or what we talk about on Sundays, I think that is well worth the effort. And I think this effort is just a part of that larger effort of turning people towards Christ.
Jeff, where does this go?
I think there's a couple things that, if we're going to use I'm sorry, I keep using Book of Mormon references here. I've been reading it, but the whole anti-Lehi Nephi, bearing the weapons, right? Like, can we stomach that? Can we stomach bearing the weapons?
Tough.
Right?
Maybe not too deep, Jeff. I mean, we'll bear a shallow grave.
But I think, if I may speak so boldly, Latter-day Saints need to continue down a path that I think they've been on, of being less insular. I think that's something that's taken place over the past few decades. Like, it doesn't have to be like, I am Mormon, we are the, the one true church, but there's a less insular and a more outward postured view that also is looking to make Christ clearly predominant in all things. And I think where evangelicals can put away their weapons but they need but hell, like, we need to make sure, people know if they're going to hell or not. I think if we can put that down, if we can stop demonizing someone who disagrees with us and just lovingly engage, I hope that's at least some of the upcoming steps that are taken. As far as where does this ultimately lead, an ongoing conversation that majors on the majors and not on the minors, and exalts Christ above all else. That's where I want to go. And I think there's a lot of other people that want to go there too. So the summit is going to be taking place in June of 2024. So June 11th through June 20th, it's 10 days. Each day of the summit is going to have a specific topic that will be spoken to both by a Latter-day Saint and a Protestant evangelical, so we can get that fully informed perspective on the topics you talked about. And it is totally free. So if you go to hellosaintssummit.com, you can fill in your information, your email address, and you'll get free access to view these videos.
Real quick, I'm going to go over the topics that are going to be covered here. What is heaven like? The image of God. What is truth? Family and marriage. Who is Jesus? Faith and politics in America. Curiosity with interfaith, church leadership, faith and reason, scripture, how to study, and grace and works, which will be a very good one.
Got a couple of religion professors from BYU. We've got both of you involved, David Butler, Hannah Stoddard from the Joseph Smith Foundation. Just a lot of really great voices in that space, Jacob Hansen. And from the evangelical standpoint, me and my wife Joy are going to do a couple presentations. Sean McDowell, who's a prominent evangelical apologist, Del Tackett, Jordan Cooper, who's a Lutheran YouTuber, and a few pastors from Utah. So there's a lot of really great voices that are going to be contributing to this. And to clarify even the format of this summit, it's one topic for each day for 10 days. And you'll hear a presentation, a talk, an interview, a conversation with a Latter-day Saint on that topic and from an evangelical on that topic. They will be separate. So you can just get that pure, like this is the belief and the position on it. And it's just really fun because there are some of the side-by-side comparisons where you're like, man, there's a lot of differences here. And there's other where you're like, I didn't realize how much we align on a lot of these things. So it's going to be true to Hello Saints and true to this whole effort to become more informed, to bring more voices to the table. And it's going to just continue this conversation of being more informed within our respective faith contexts. And I'm really excited because Kurt is actually going to be involved in one of the presentations. And Kurt, I don't know if you want to talk about how we're handling that day.
Yeah. So I have the opportunity to sit down with a group of pastors, and myself as a former bishop. We're going to talk leadership. We're going to talk about dynamics they face. And it's just, I think there's so much we can learn from stepping out of our tradition and seeing what the other guy does, with these, running meetings or encouraging faith or helping people overcome pornography, all these typical things that church leaders face. Sometimes we only talk as bishop to bishop, but let's talk bishop to pastor, and it'll be awesome.
And then on that same day, I'm going to be sitting with a group of bishops. So you have Kurt sitting with pastors, you have me sitting with bishops, and it should be a pretty great conversation. That's just one example of the type of perspectives we're hoping to bring to the summit.
Awesome. Well, great. Kurt and Jeff, thanks so much for your time. Always very fun. We'll bring you both on soon.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks.